Well, for those of you who may be tuning in, I think we're supposed to start in about 30 seconds, but hopefully you'll all be joining here in a few minutes. I'm going to ask for anybody who is tuning in to go ahead and just put your name into the comments section so that we can have a little bit of a group discussion and all know who's here and be able to dialogue with each other a little bit in terms of questions and whatnot. So as people come online here in the next minute or so, go ahead and just sign in. I see. Hi, Carla. And so glad you could join us. My name is Greg Smith. I am the Dean of the Lakeshore Academy for the New Evangelization, and I serve also as the Director of Ministry at Our Lady of the Lake Catholic Parish. And we're so excited that you could join us for this very first online lane course. This is something we've talked about doing in the past. But we never really, wanted to figure out how, or had the time to figure out how to master all the parts and the pieces. But of course, the lockdown that we're all under has forced us all to learn new things and to adapt. So I want to ask in advance for your forgiveness a little bit, or your patience a little bit, because as we're trying to learn how to do this, the technology is all a little bit new. In fact, this afternoon we were fiddling around. I was going to be able to show some live video or show some videos and some fly-throughs I'd built in Google Earth and some things like that. But unfortunately, we're having problems getting the computer technology to work exactly as we want it to. So this is a new thing for us, and we're learning new things. And I'm sure that between now and the next broadcast and the upcoming broadcasts, we're going to get better and better and work out the kinks. And hopefully you'll stick with us on that. So thank you for joining us. Again, this is a new thing for us. And, we're being forced into this, moment a little bit by the lockdown. And I know that everybody in the world is scrambling to try to improvise and adapt and develop new methods and new technologies and new ways of getting things done and just sort of step up into these circumstances. And we're certainly trying to do that, not only at Our Lady of the Lake, but at the Lakeshore Academy for the New Evangelization. And to that end, we want to make sure that we're serving you during this time when we're all sort of locked in our homes. And so what we've done is we've been working very hard the last couple of weeks to develop a lot of new content for Lane to be for this April. And so that during the time that we're sort of all locked out of the church, we're going to launch a lot of new programs. And I'd like to at least start tonight by telling you about some of the classes and offerings that we have coming up here in the month of April. These are all listed on the Lane website. Go to lanecatholic.org and you can see them there. But let me just take a few minutes to tell you about them because I think we're pretty excited. We've been working hard to put them together. So we have 4 new classes that we're putting out here this April in an online format. The first one is this, Coming Home, Restoring Worship After Calamity. And we'll talk a little bit more about the plan for this class in a few minutes. But we have 3 others in addition to that. So we have one called The Gospel According to the Rosary. That will take place here on Facebook Live on April 8th, so a week from tonight at this time. About a year or so ago, I did a Lane Lab workshop called The Gospel According to the Rosary. And we're going to take some of that material and sort of refocus it and repackage it and not perform it, but put it on for you here. And I want to just kind of tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. The Rosary is amazing. St. John Paul II called the 4 sets of Rosary mysteries, of course, the joyful and the sorrowful and the glorious and the luminous. He called them a perfect compendium of the gospel. There's sort of a perfect summary of the incarnation, the suffering and death, the ministry and the resurrection of Christ and the establishment of his church. And what's amazing is that for 800 years, by praying those rosary mysteries and meditating upon those mysteries, it sort of burns the gospel and the cycle of the gospel into sort of your mental muscle memory. And so we're going to walk through that a week from tonight. I'm going to kind of talk through those rosary mysteries and how they not only help us, like I said, summarize the gospel, but how they're a powerful defense against a lot of the errors and misunderstandings and heresies and whatnot that face the church, have always faced the church, but face the church today. And so we're going to do that a week from tonight. Same thing is this: register through the Lane website. You'll be able to get access to the materials. It'll be on Facebook Live, and you won't be sorry for that. I think it'll be powerful. The other one that'll be coming up after that is one called Jonah, Fugitive from Justice. So this is going to be a 4-part sort of Bible study or Bible survey or class into the 4 chapters of Jonah. The book of Jonah only has 4 chapters. And Jonah is a fascinating book and I think pretty relevant for today. Jonah was a guy who objected to God's sense of justice. He was somebody who he didn't like God's ideas about how God was going to run the world and God's sense of justice and how God was going to play his justice out in the life of Israel and the life of the people around him and in Jonah's life. And so he rebelled and he rejected that. And he especially didn't like his place in God's plan. He rejected his vocation. And so the book of Jonah is a tremendous insight into those struggles that we all have about the justice of God. Why does he put us or put nations to the circumstances that he puts us through? How do we find our place in that? And how do we accept our place in that and sort of make peace with the justice of God? So calling that class Jonah, Fugitive from Justice. And what's going to be a little unique about that is we're going to offer it at noon. And you can go to the website, again, lanecatholic.org, and you see it there, Jonah, Fugitive from Justice. But it'll take place on April 13, 15, 20, and 22 from noon to 1 p.m. So kind of a lunchtime piece here on Facebook Live. And again, there'll be additional materials that you can get if you register. Another one is going to come at the end of April. And I'm pretty excited about this. Been working actually on it for a long time, but this seems like a great occasion. And I'm calling this class, Why Go to Church? Simple question. We've all been prevented from going to church here for a time. And I know a lot of us are eager to get back, and we can't wait to get back, and we want the church to be packed. I'm a little concerned that it's not going to be as packed as we think. And here's why. Church attendance in every denomination, in every demographic, has been falling for 20, 30 years before the coronavirus lockdown. And while a lot of us sort of feel pent up and eager to get back, one of my fears is that a lot of the people who didn't have a strong inclination to go before this have now had several months to simply reinforce their habit of not going. And my fear is that when we open the churches again, it's going to be when the weather is warm, and it's going to simply reinforce everybody's habit of avoiding going. And I know a lot of us struggle with people in our lives, loved ones, friends, family members who don't attend church. And so what I've done is put together a special 2-part class that simply answers the question, why should we go to church in the first place? And I think that it will hopefully equip you with some things that you can share and that you can say to those people in your life who ask the question, why even bother to go? So that one's at the end of April. Again, go to the Lane website and look. And one more thing before I move off this preview of coming attractions. Is another feature that we've put together for you is something called Fast Lane Questions. So there is a button on the Lane website, and there's also a link so that you can email. And the idea is that if you have any questions about Bible, doctrine, church history, Catholic identity, Catholic teaching, the Mass, liturgy, whatnot, go ahead and send those questions in. And then once a week, I and some of the other Lane instructors will take those and we'll record short answers to them, short video answers and short video responses, 2 minutes or less. So we're calling those fast Lane questions. We'll take all the ones that come in, pick some, and answer them once a week. And so every week we'll put up a few new answers, and over time, a category, a sort of FAQ library will grow online. And we're kind of excited about that. So those are all the kinds of things that we've got coming up. Kind of the preview of coming attractions, and I hope that you'll stick with us and engage in those. So go to the website, look at them, and whatnot. So that being said, let's turn to the class at hand. This class coming home, restoring God's worship after calamity. Now, let me just explain the sort of mechanics of this class. If you've signed up, then you should have gotten a link today, emailed to you. And that was a link to a folder. And in that folder, you'll find two things. First of all, you'll find a PDF handout that you can download for tonight's lesson or for the first chapter. And you'll also find an audio file. So what I've done is I'm recording 7 different chapters, audio chapters. They're kind of like podcasts for this class. And I'll be uploading them over the course of this next week. I uploaded the first one today. I hope to upload 1 or 2 tomorrow, 1 or 2 on Friday, probably a batch over the weekend. Download those. They're all about 25 or 30 minutes long. You can listen to them. And every time I upload one, I'll upload the handout that accompanies it. So you can listen to sort of the audio course book and handouts. And then a week from tonight, we'll do this again, same time, same place here, same bat channel. And we'll be able to sort of wrap up the class, answer your questions, have a good discussion about the things that came up through that audio course book and the handouts. So that's kind of the plan for this class. Make sure that you get that handout and you get that audio file and take a listen to it. Okay, so all that being said, and I can see a lot of comments throwing here, and I got to say, this is the first time that I've taught anything quite like this, and at least in this format. I've been teaching since I was an undergraduate, and I was a TA for professors when I was 20, 21. And so I've been teaching in front of classrooms my whole life, but this is just a new format for me. So if I seem a little distracted, I'm trying to watch the screen and watch your comments and manage a lot of things. And so just be patient as I try to sort of figure it out and learn how to do it. So that being said, I see a lot of you saying hi. I'm really glad that you're here. So let's turn to this class tonight and talk a little bit about what we're going through right now. The idea for this particular course tonight obviously came out of what we're living through. We're living through really an extraordinary chapter in history. And I say that because I can't think of another time in church history where God's people, the church, has been in so many places, almost globally, locked out of worship. Private masses are occurring, but there's no corporate masses in most of the world right now. And even for Protestants, there's no collective worship. I can't think of another time in church history where that's happened. I mean, I can think of moments in church history where, say, a particular city, was unable to worship for a couple of months because of a war or a plague or, something like that. Certainly when the Black Death was ravaging Europe in the 14th and later centuries, there were times when a city would be in lockdown or shut down, but a global shutdown of worship? I don't know that that's ever happened in 2,000 years. And I'm certain that there's been no time in 2,000 years where God's people haven't celebrated Easter corporately. We really are living through an extraordinary moment in history. And I got to say that everybody's going to have their own take and their own memories from this thing. But, for me, the most outstanding image, or the most memorable, the most haunting image of this entire coronavirus, COVID, days of COVID, season of COVID, was Pope Francis's Urbi et Orbi blessing and homily last week. Now, I don't know if you saw it. I think we're putting that link up to the YouTube or a couple of YouTubes of it on the website. And I think Corey's dropping it in the comment thread here. I don't know how to describe how important that was, how moving that was, how powerful that was, and how relevant it was to the topic that we're going to be studying in this class. Promise me that after this session is over, you'll click those YouTubes and watch them. Because what we saw was an empty St. Peter's Piazza. Empty. And we saw a solitary Pope in the twilight, in the rain, climbing the steps to St. Peter's. And he gets to the portico, goes into the narthex, and he takes the Blessed Sacrament and holds the monstrance up and looks back out across the piazza, past the obelisk that marks where Peter was crucified upside down. He looks across that piazza down towards Castel San Angelo, where another pope 500 years ago was holed up under siege when the city was ravaged by death and disease and war. And he blesses the city and the world. That's what Urbi et Orbi means. As the rain comes down, the only lights are the blue police lights around the edge of the piazza and the colonnade there. And his homily, promise me you'll watch it. I think that for the days of COVID or the season of COVID, that's probably one of the most singular, powerful images or haunting images I've ever seen in my whole life. I would rank it up there for me with seeing the towers come down on 9/11, or a man walk on the moon, or the people tear down the Berlin Wall. We are living through a moment in history where we have been shut out of worship and shut out of the church. And this is extraordinary. Hundreds of years from now, we'll be talking about it, and we'll be looking at those images. And so what can we learn from that? What can we learn from this moment of history? Because as much as this is a singular moment in church history, I can't think of another time when the church has been sort of collectively barred from worship for an extended period of time like this. It's not the first time that God's people have been kept from worshiping for an extended period of time. So when we go to the Old Testament, we find that for about 72 years, God's people were unable to carry out the liturgies and the sacrifices and the worship that God prescribed for them. And that's what this class is about. We're going to talk through that. You can listen, like I said, to the audio podcasts or the audio episodes that I'm recording that unpack that. But this is an extraordinary time in history. And I want to spend some time talking about it tonight to set up those podcasts, answer your questions, and have some dialogue. So that being said, as I'm talking, I'm going to try to keep scrolling and paying attention to the comment thread. And if you have a question, you have a comment, please go ahead and throw it up in the comment thread, and I'm going to try to respond to those as we go. So let's tell the story, this extraordinary story, or give you an overview of the story of what happened when God's people were barred from worship for over 70 years. To understand the story, we have to go back to the beginning. If we go back, there were only 3 kings that served or that ruled over a united Israel: Saul, David, and David's son Solomon. Those are the only 3 kings that ever ruled over a united Israel. When Solomon died around 932 BC, he didn't have a clear heir, someone to inherit the throne. And so a civil war broke out amongst his sons, or the contenders for the throne. And what that resulted in is the country of Israel was divided up into 2 separate nations. It was split up into a northern country called Israel that was centered on the city, or its capital was in the city of Samaria, and a southern kingdom called Judah. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because we think of Israel, and after 932 BC, Israel only refers to that northern kingdom with its capital in Samaria, whereas Judah refers to the southern kingdom with its capital at Jerusalem. And again, these were tiny countries. I mean, I looked it up the other day. Judah, the land mass, or the area of Judah, was only something like 1,600 miles. And I looked it up, and that's about the approximate square mileage of Ottawa County, Michigan. So you're talking about a country about more or less the size of Ottawa County, Michigan, in the case of Judah. So you have the nation of Israel in the north, and you have the nation of Judah in the south. And what happens very quickly is that both nations fall into pagan worship. Now, it's a big question as to, how would you fall into pagan worship? I mean, we look at that today and we say, what would make you, what would make someone start to worship foreign gods, Baal and Asherah and all these kinds of things? I think that what happened is it came on very easily, and it came on very naturally, and it came on very organically for them, and they probably didn't even realize what they were doing. We think about our desire to be culturally relevant, to relate to the culture around us, and this is something that God warned the Israelites about over and over and over again. He said, "You're going to be surrounded by pagans, people who don't worship your God. They're going to live next to you. They're going to be the people you do business with. They're going to be neighbors and colleagues and all these kinds of things, and surround the farms. You're going to have to trade with them. And what'll happen over time is you'll want to fit in." He warns the Israelites over and over and over again. He warns the Hebrews. You're going to want to join their festivals. I mean, what's the harm in going down and doing a little, festival on May Day or at a summer solstice? Everybody's doing it. It's like a big picnic, like a big party. So what? It's like the 4th of July. They begin to intermarry. Their sons and their daughters marry into these other pagan families. They begin to adopt the songs and the music and gradually they sort of culturally assimilate. And before you know it, they wake up and they're worshiping foreign gods. Now, there were principally 2 foreign gods that the Canaanites had. I mean, they had many of them. There were 2 big ones. Baal, who was a male god, and Asherah or Astarte, who was a female god. And they were worshipped in groves of trees where there would be a shrine, or up on these hilltops where there would be a shrine. And what happened is it became very natural for people to sort of in the folk religion of the day to just start going down to the shrines and the groves or up onto the hilltops to celebrate festivals and important days, to ask for help with the crops, to do this and that. And gradually it just seemed natural to fit in. In fact, I think it's probably likely that for the Hebrews, at some level, there's a kind of embarrassment. You don't want to be backwards. The Hebrews go, we don't want to have this backwards religion from the traveling Hebrews with the desert god Yahweh. We want to fit in to the culture that we're with, and we want to join in. And so they do. And what happens is over the generations, they very quickly find themselves worshiping these foreign gods, and the worship of Yahweh slips away more and more and more and more. It gets so bad that most of the country is doing it. Some of you remember the story from the Old Testament about Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, the contest between them. King Ahab at that time, who was a king of Israel in the northern kingdom, had 400 prophets of Baal who attended him. And Elijah has this contest with them to determine who is the real God. Is it Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, or the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Old Testament, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Or is it Baal? And you can remember that story. One of the things I think is haunting about that story is that God tells Elijah at one point to take comfort that that God, Yahweh, still has 7,000 followers in the nation of Israel, or in the land of Israel, that had not yet worshipped Baal. Now, that's kind of a good news, bad news thing, isn't it, right? I mean, hey, the good news is there's 700,000 people in this country, and the good news is there's 7,000 of them that are not worshiping Baal, but 99% are. I mean, that's how desperate the situation was. And it got worse and worse and worse. I mean, it got so bad. I mean, the worship of these gods was detestable to Yahweh. The worship of these gods involved ritual orgies, temple prostitutes, abortion, infanticide, um, all kinds of things that were detestable and abominations to Yahweh. And yet the people kept giving themselves to these foreign gods, what the Bible keeps calling, the prophets keep calling the gods of wood and stone, because of their idols and their icons. So in any case, this goes on and on and on. It develops year after year, generation after generation, king after king, priest after priest, people after generation of people after generation of people. It gets so bad that at one point in the land of Judah, they begin to worship a foreign god called Molech. Now, Molech was a god that demanded the human sacrifice of infants, believe it or not. In the Valley of Hinnom, which is just outside the wall of Jerusalem, on the walls of Jerusalem, in a sort of low area gully outside there, they set up a giant bronze statue. And in the statue was a terribly hot fire. And there was like an opening or a mouth that you would toss children into. They called it passing through the fire to Molech to win the favor of God, of the god Molech. And this happened just outside the wall of Jerusalem. In fact, centuries later, when Jesus in his teaching would describe hell, he would use a Greek word that was related to the Hebrew word for the Valley of Hinnom, basically a reference to the horrors and the demonic horrors that took place in the worship of Molech there. Basically, the people had turned from Yahweh. And through the centuries, God warned them over and over and over again, you must turn back to me. In fact, one of the consistent metaphors in the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, is the metaphor of marriage, inasmuch as God sort of marries his people, that he is like the bridegroom and they are like the bride. And over and over again in the prophets, he describes Israel and Judah as like adulterous wives. In fact, he uses pretty stark language about that when he talks about them committing adultery with these foreign gods rather than being faithful to the God who loved them and had cared for them and wanted them. Well, time goes on. It gets worse and worse and worse. God sends prophet after prophet after prophet warning the people that unless they turn back, unless they turn once again to Yahweh, they've stepped out of his protection, and he will no longer protect them from the ravenous, barbaric, warlike empires that surrounded them. And so in 722, so basically, right, if you can track 200 years after Solomon's death, the Assyrian Empire, which was sort of up in the north, it would be northeast of the land of Israel, the Assyrian Empire came down and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. They devastated the city of Samaria. They razed it to the ground, and they hauled most of its leading citizens away to serve in the Assyrian Empire. And they then moved foreigners in. This was a tactic of the Assyrians. They would pull a people out of their home and move other people in, so it would dislocate peoples and they would never rise up again. And so they took the Israelites, the people of the northern kingdom, citizens of Israel, the Assyrians hauled them away and brought these other people in, and they destroyed the city of Samaria. It's why to this day there is no city of Samaria in the nation of Israel. It doesn't exist. And it's also interesting that's why there was bad blood between the Jews and the Samaritans for centuries and centuries to come. You know, the Jews considered the Samaritans to be half-breeds because they were basically apostates who had been conquered by the Assyrians and then bred with these other foreigners that had moved in. You remember in the Gospels, there's this fascinating story where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at a well in the area of Samaria, even though the city of Samaria is not there anymore, in that region. And Jesus and this woman have this fascinating dialogue about where the Jews worship. She says, you Jews worship up on the mountain in Jerusalem, but we worship in other places. And so there's this interesting background that even kind of comes into the Gospels about the collapse of the northern kingdom versus the southern kingdom. So in any case, in 722, the northern kingdom is destroyed for its faithlessness to Yahweh. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah, again, in the capital of Jerusalem, lasts another 140 years. So another 140 years go on, but the same sort of cycle is taking place. It just takes a little longer to play out. And without getting too much into the history, at a certain point, the Babylonian Empire had kind of risen up and conquered the Assyrian Empire. And so the Babylonians, 140 years later, were now the dominant power under King Nebuchadnezzar. And they came into Judea and demanded, or basically tried to impose, that Judah would become a vassal state, basically a province under the Babylonians and serving King Nebuchadnezzar. The politics get really complicated, and you can listen. I talk a little bit about it in the podcast, but the politics get pretty complicated. But in the end, the result is that the Babylonians surround the city of Jerusalem. Eventually, they take the city. And this is the important part. They dismantle it. They tear the walls down, because a city without walls is not a city. It's not secure. It doesn't have a place. It doesn't have an identity. It can't secure itself. They destroy the walls. They rip the city apart brick from brick. And then they destroy the Temple of Solomon, which was in the city. They utterly destroy, dismantle the Temple of Solomon. And they take the sacred objects, so the liturgical vessels, the candelabras, all these kinds of things that were necessary for the liturgies of the Israelites, or the liturgies of the Jews in the temple. They haul those things away. Now, an interesting thing that I'll address in one of the podcasts, and we'll address next week at this time, is what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. Where did it go? It sort of just goes missing at this time. But the sacred objects for the liturgy end up being hauled away to Babylon, where the Babylonian king can show his superiority over the Jews by drinking his wine out of their liturgical vessels. So the Israelites then are hauled away to Babylon, or at least not all of them, but the best and the brightest of their people, particularly the best and brightest of their young people. It's a great tactic if you want to conquer a people. The Romans did some of this too. What they would do is they would take your best and brightest young people. They would bring them to the capital of the conquering nation, and they would educate them in the ways of that nation and its language and its laws and its politics, and they would give them then important jobs, right? So basically, all of the people who would be potential leaders that could help the conquered people sort of rise up again and take their nation back were compromised, because they had become high officials and completely assimilated into the conquering nation. And it kept conquering peoples down. So that's what they do to the Jews. And they haul away, and in one of the podcasts I'll talk about this, but they haul the folks away. Some of them the most famous of them is Daniel, who and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are four very bright young men who are taken away to Babylon into the court of Nebuchadnezzar, given new Babylonian names, educated in Babylonian practices and law and court, court manners. They're completely assimilated into the Babylonians, and they're given important jobs. In the case of Daniel, he becomes essentially the prime minister of Babylon. And it's a way then to compromise your people. Now, let me just say something, and I'll talk more in the second podcast, which will be coming out in the next day or so, called Divine Chessboard, about this, what happens to them while they're captives or exiles in Babylon. And I think the really important thing is that what happens is this terrible, because of their own fault, God gives them over to their sin. But there's this old saying, you never know what you've got until it's gone. And when they when they find themselves in Babylon, it's an occasion for them to repent and be transformed and to sort of reinvent themselves in some important ways. Let me put it this way. Before the fall of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon, they had been simply a nation state with a sort of old civil religion. You know what I mean by civil religion? It was the official religion of the government. There's a temple up there that Solomon built 300 years ago. There's certain rituals, that sort of state rituals that take place. We kind of carry that out. Maybe nobody really believes in it. It's kind of pro forma. It's just sort of part of our statecraft, our civil practices. It's kind of like saying the Pledge of Allegiance. There isn't really a dedication to Yahweh. When they get ripped away and become not slaves, but become exiles in Babylon, what happens is they have to reassess who they are. And it's an important thing because what happens in Babylon during these years of exile is that they become Jews. And what I mean by that is their sort of national civil religion is transformed into a living faith because they can't worship. And this is why I think this is so critical for us during this COVID season, because while we're kept out of our churches, we have the opportunity to realize what we had. And we have the opportunity to think of church not just as a habit, not just as a place that we go to do programs. And those things are all important. But the Jews had a chance to assess their faith because without the temple, without the sacrifices, without the liturgy, without the priesthood carrying those things out, all they had was God's word. This is a real critical point to make. And I think when I was a Protestant, I thought I got it, but I don't think I completely got it as much as I get it as a Catholic. And that is that I would think, well, you can worship anywhere. I mean, they can go to Babylon, they can, read the words of Moses, they can sing songs, they can say prayers. Does it really matter where they are? Does it really matter where they worship? Wherever they gather and they read some scripture and they sing some songs and they say a prayer, isn't that worship? Well, no. It wasn't worship because there was no sacrifice. And this is a really, really important point to understand, that the Old Testament required sacrifice for worship. It wasn't just singing songs and reading scripture and saying prayers. I mean, yeah, anybody could do that in a synagogue. But the religion of Israel required sacrifice for atonement. To be made right with God, there had to be sacrifices, and the sacrifices were prescribed. The books of Moses very specifically laid out what the sacred spaces were supposed to be like, what the sacred vessels were, what the rituals were, how the sacrifices were to be performed, the way they were to be performed, how the priesthood in their vestments and their gestures were to operate in order to make those valid sacrifices. And so what happens is that while they can gather in Babylon and read scripture and sing songs and say a prayer together, they can't genuinely worship. They can't be atoned. They can't be made right with God because there is no sacrifice. It calls to mind for us that the Mass it's not a re-sacrifice of Christ, so it's a participation in the sacrifice of Christ. And without the sacrifice of Christ, it's just reading and singing songs, which is all well and good in itself. But it is the sacrifice of Christ that makes it valid. And and the point I'm trying to drive at is that when they were in exile, they couldn't worship. They could do other things, they could do spiritual things, but they couldn't actually worship and be made right with God. And so this time drove them into those other things. Did it in some specific ways. First of all, during this time, they began to self-consciously think of themselves as Jews, not as citizens of Israel or Judah. As long as they were living in Israel or Judah, in those kingdoms, they were sort of descended from, the traveling Hebrews who had taken the land. They were descendants and citizens of the land that was given, the promised land that was given. And their religion was very much wrapped up into that national identity. When you took that away from them, their identity was redefined, and they became redefined, and this is an important point, they became redefined as people of the book, people of the scriptures, the people who inherited the faith of Moses, the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They became people who looked to Yahweh. They became people who were custodians of the word of the law and the prophets. And they transformed themselves into a people who not only cared for those things, but longed for the restoration of their worship. And it redefined them from being basically just citizens of Israel or citizens of Judah who happen to participate in the ancient civil religion into Jews, people who self-consciously thought of them as the descendants of those who, of inheritors of the covenant of Moses. And this is huge. And one of the projects that they begin while they're in exile is they begin to compile the Old Testament. Now, we think of the Old Testament, right, as sort of a finished thing. But you got to understand it wasn't finished at the time. And it wasn't finished because quite a number of the books of the Old Testament, the prophetic books of the Old Testament, weren't written yet. I mean, a number of the prophets prophesied during the Babylonian captivity. A number of the books of the Old Testament describe the return of the Israelites or the Judites or the Jews to Israel. I mean, you've got books like Ezra and Nehemiah. You have prophets like Zechariah. You have books like Esther, Tobit. None of those books were written before the exile. So what happens is in the exile, they start taking the old books, the books of Moses, the law, some of the early prophetic books, and they begin to organize those. They begin to compile them. The new prophets are rising, like Jeremiah is writing, Ezra, and other prophets, Zechariah and others, Micah. These books are being written, and they're gathering them, and they're building what would in the end become the Old Testament. So this time of exile is incredibly productive for them. It's a time where they redefine themselves. They redefine their faith. They discover their identity as Jews. They build the Old Testament. They long for and they preserve the memory of how to do the sacrifices. They study the laws of Moses so that one day when they return, they can restore the worship. And the priestly class, those descended from the line of Aaron, are able during this time to prepare themselves for their eventual return. So God takes this exile and uses that in incredibly productive ways. It becomes sort of a crucible that transforms them. Well, eventually, what happens is God begins to move the pieces around on sort of the divine chessboard. As I said, empires rise and fall. The Assyrian Empire was dominant in the middle part of the 8th century BC. It was replaced by the rise of the Babylonian Empire, which in turn was replaced by the rise of the Persian Empire. This has been going on through history. One country or nation or empire is dominant for a century or two, and then it gets conquered by somebody else, and who's on first and who's on top. And this goes on. And during this time, what God is doing, though, is repositioning the pieces on the chessboard for the return. Because when the Persian Empire defeats the Babylonians and takes over the land, eventually the land that we know of, the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and Judah falls under the Persians, there is a new Persian emperor, Cyrus the Great. And he doesn't have the issues that the Babylonians had with the Jews going back to the War of Conquest. And so Cyrus becomes open to and favorable to allowing the Jews to return. And in fact, One of the people that we'll meet in the podcast episodes or the audio episodes, a leader named Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is a Jew who is named by the Persians to be the governor of the province, the Persian province that includes Judah. And so, as the governor of that province, he's able to ask the Persian emperor for permission to take 42,000 of his fellow Jews back to restore the city and restore the temple. And because God has moved all of these people around on the board, the chessboard, in such a way that the right people are in the right places with the right political circumstances, 42,000 Jews are able to migrate back from Persia, a land in a city in Persia called Susa, down near Basra in modern day Iran, and they come back with permission from the emperor, with Zerubbabel as the governor, and they begin to clear the rubble and clear the site where Jerusalem was to begin to rebuild the temple. And they've had now 50, 60, 70 years to plan this, to study the books of Moses, to plan for the restoration of temple worship. So they come back, clear the site, begin to rebuild the temple. You know, the temple that was destroyed in 588 was the Temple of Solomon, the temple Solomon had built. What they begin to build is what is known as the Second Temple, obviously because it's the second temple, which later Herod the Great would sort of, he didn't rebuild it, but he beautified it. Let's put it that way. He did an upgrade on it, and it became the Temple of Herod. So what they build when they come back is in the Second Temple, which would sort of be, like I said, renovated into Herod's temple, is the temple that Jesus himself would come to in his ministry when Christ came. And that temple gets built by these returning migrants under Zerubbabel and a priest of the Aaronic line who named Joshua, who comes back, and they're able to reestablish not only the physical temple, but they're able to reestablish the priesthood, and they're able to bring back some of the sacred vessels. Because remember, I said some of the chalices and liturgical vessels had been taken by the Babylonians. Well, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, they took possession of those things, and Cyrus gives them back to Zerubbabel and Joshua, the priest, who come back and reestablish temple worship. Now, right around that time or shortly thereafter, a couple of decades later, once again, God moving things around the divine chessboard, there's another man. And this man's name is Nehemiah. Nehemiah, God has again moved the pieces around the chessboard, is the cupbearer to the emperor of Persia. So he stands at his side and is almost like a major domo, like a butler who manages affairs of state or state banquets, and bears the cups and stands and serves him. So he has got this relationship, very intimate relationship with the emperor of Persia. And in the book of Nehemiah, he relates that the emperor one night was looking at him at a banquet and said, "Man, Nehemiah, you look, really downcast. What's wrong?" And he said, "My heart is heavy because my people, the Jews, have returned and they've tried to rebuild their temple, but there is no wall around the city anymore. 70 years ago or 100 years ago, when the Babylonians destroyed it, they destroyed the walls. And so Zerubbabel and Joshua had rebuilt a temple, but it was insecure. There were always bandits and raiders and people trying to break into it and raid the city and the people, the survivors who were living around it. And so the emperor says, "Well, what would you like me to do?" And he said, "Give me permission and give me resources, give me materials to go back and rebuild the walls of my city, Jerusalem." And Nehemiah had won such favor with the emperor of Persia that the emperor of Persia said, "Not only will I do that, I'll give you not only letters to introduce you to all of the Persian officials along the way, I'll give you basically purchase orders so you can get bricks, stone, wood, everything you need to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and make that city, your ancestral city, secure once again. So Nehemiah comes back, and this is now in the 400s BC, and reestablishes the walls of that city. So within 70 to 100 years after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of its walls and temple, there is a second temple, there is restored worship, and the walls of the city are secure again, and it becomes once again a holy city for the Jews. Well, what happened after that? Well, what happened after that? You'll have to listen to the last episode of the podcast when it comes out, number 7, because I'm calling that episode Gravity. Sin is a lot like gravity, or at least sin has the sort of power that gravity has in our lives, right? I mean, gravity is always sort of trying to pull you down. It takes energy. It takes energy to walk up the stairs, right? It takes energy to throw a ball in the air. It takes energy for an airplane to get off the ground. It takes energy to sort of overcome the pull and the gravity of sin. And even though the Jews eventually in this story come back and they restore the temple, they build a second temple, they restore their worship, and they restore their walls, the gravity of sin eventually begins to pull at them again. And it pulls at them again. But this time around, it pulls at them in some very different ways. And we'll cover that in the last episode of the podcast. And we'll cover that next week in this broadcast. Because what happens after that, during the period of the Maccabees and the conquest of the Romans, is that there is a new kind of Judaism in Israel that's very different than the than the religion of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. And when Christ comes, there is an expectation of the Messiah. For all of the faults of the Sadducees and Pharisees and the Jews of Jesus' day, they were longing, and they were hungry, and they were expectant of the Messiah, and they were conscious of who they were. They were conscious of their law. They were jealous and zealous for the word. I mean, that's why when John the Baptist came, they were so eager to repent and eager for a Messiah to come. And they studied the word of God so much. And that's all part of that legacy of their transformation that occurred in the exile. So, to kind of wrap up tonight, and then I'll start to take a couple of questions. What I would say is, I hope that when we get to return to church, and it won't be 72 years, I hope it won't be 72 days, that God will, in a similar way, have done some things inside us, that he will make us more zealous for his word, that he will make us more appreciative of our worship and the opportunity to worship, that he will help forge a more self-conscious identity in us as God's people who serve him and long for him. And that when we come back, and when the gravity of sin pulls at us again, because it will, that next time, after this season of interruption of worship in the church globally is over, there'll be a new zealousness for the things of God. And there'll be a new zealousness for the mission of the church, and a new awareness. If you got a homework assignment in addition to doing all of this, make sure you watch that Urbi et Orbi homily by Pope Francis. And if you can, download it and read it. Maybe we can put that link up on the website. But that's probably one of the best sermons I've ever heard in my life. And I've heard a lot of sermons because of the time, the place, the circumstances. It was extraordinary, and it spoke to me, and I think it should speak to us extraordinarily about not only what has happened to us during this interruption in our worship, but what can happen to us and how God can use this for our good. So let me kind of scroll through here, see if any of you have any questions. Again, don't hesitate to type in the comments here. I again, trying to learn how to teach this way with the comment bar. But those are some of the things that that I think we want to be thinking about. I hope that as we live through this time, that we're preparing ourselves. This is a time in the wilderness. It is a time of exile. It is a time of refraining from, from being able to worship, and I think a tremendous amount of good can happen in us through that. So, again, if you have any questions or comments, I'm willing to take them at this time. Go ahead and type them in. And while I'm waiting for that or other things, just a reminder about the things that we have coming up here this month. So the audio lessons will be in the folder. You'll get emails every time I upload a new audio lesson. Make sure you listen to those. We'll be back here 1 week from tonight. And when we come back a week from tonight, what we'll be doing here is I'll be now I laid out tonight sort of the big picture of the story. We'll be sort of looking back on that story a little bit more reflectively. And I hope while you're listening to those podcasts or those audio episodes, you'll be coming up with some questions for discussion, and I'd be happy to answer them online. Also, we've got these other classes coming up. Make sure that you take a look at, question here. How do the podcasts relate to the class lecture? Well, they basically are the class lectures. So if you, every day you listen to a different chapter. I'm going to probably upload them in batches of 2 or 3. But so there's 7 chapters in this class. Chapter 1, Exile. Chapter 2, Divine Chessboard. Chapter 3, I'm calling 42,000. Chapter 4, I'm calling Site Prep. Chapter 5, I'm calling Second Temple, then Walls, then Gravity. Every one of them is going to be about 25 to 30 minutes long. You listen to those. Those are basically like an audio textbook for this story. There'll be a handout with each one. And that's how you'll be able to engage and to be able to unpack the story. We'll unpack the story that way together. And then, of course, a week from tonight, we'll recap that. We'll dive a little bit deeper now that, you've had a chance to listen to those and to immerse yourselves in the details of the story. We'll dive a little bit deeper into some elements of it. Make sure you're downloading those podcasts. And then make sure you look at the Lane website for these other things coming up. I'm kind of excited about the lunchtime, 4-part lunchtime Jonah series, class in Jonah. I think if you've not really immersed yourself in the story of Jonah, the 4 chapters of Jonah, one of the most remarkable stories in the Bible with all kinds of application to what we're living through today. And then a week from tonight, I think it is, 1 week from tonight, this coming Monday night is the wrap up of this class. A week from tonight is the Gospel according to the Rosary, and that's going to be super valuable too. So I hope you'll join me for that. What we'll do is I'll spend about an hour teaching on the mysteries, and then we'll actually pray the Rosary together. On this format. Kathy, you can share these. Sure, you can share them outside of what's registered. If you've got the audio, go ahead and share it. We during this time of during this whole time, we just want to get a lot of content. We're here at Lane and at Our Lady of the Lake, really trying to serve our people under difficult circumstances. I know everybody is, medical professionals and manufacturers and first responders, government officials. Everybody's trying to serve everybody else, and we're trying to serve as best we can using the limitations of the technology we have, but to get things out. So by all means, go ahead and share those. Going into the future, we will probably be offering some distance learning opportunities for Lane in the fall. We've had a lot of interest from the Diocese of Grand Rapids about extending Lane throughout the diocese. And of course, one of the challenges that is logistically, how do we do that? How do we get people who live on the other side of Grand Rapids to participate in these classes? And so we'd already been thinking about different kinds of distance formats, and so this is just sort of forcing our hand to figure that out a little bit quicker. Go ahead and share the video, share everything. Also pray the Rosary with Father Mike. Two last things before I shut off. We will continue to pray the rosary on Fridays at noon on Facebook Live with Father Mike. And then also, I can announce tonight, I think it'll be coming out tomorrow, we are going to be doing a full set of Holy Week liturgies at Our Lady of the Lake. So Palm Sunday, Good Friday, the Triduum, Easter Vigil, and Easter Sunday. All of those liturgies are going to be taking place. The bishop has given us permission under the executive order to have no more than 10 people in the room so that Father Mike can have a pianist, a cantor, a lector, somebody working the camera. And we're going to be broadcasting the Holy Week liturgies from Our Lady of the Lake Sanctuary this next week. So stay tuned. I think an email is going out about that tomorrow, and you can stay at home and join in the Holy Week liturgies at Our Lady of the Lake that way. So blessings. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful week. Make sure that if you have a question, hit that fast lane button, and I'll respond to them as quickly as I can. Thanks. Blessings.